You ever watch a man walk into a church every Sunday for 22 years and shake the hand of the person who killed your friend? I have. I watched it happen. I watched the whole town do it. Trent Overton was 26 years old when they pulled him out of the Apalachicola River, June of 2001. The ruling was accidental drowning. Case closed before the body was cold. My name is Crosby Whitfield. I'm 39. I run a boat repair shop on Water Street in Apalachicola, Florida. And when I was 9 years old, I saw something on that dock that nobody ever believed. The man the town mourned with, the man who gave the eulogy, who shook hands with Trent's mother every Christmas, was Circuit Judge Harlan Briggs. He'd been on the bench 28 years. His name was on the youth baseball diamond. He ran the 4th of July fish fry. Nobody believed a 9-year-old boy who was out past curfew, and the judge looked me in the eye at the funeral and put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "You're a brave kid, Crosby. Trent would have been proud of you." His hand was still bruised. Now, if you want to hear how I spent 22 years carrying that, and what happened the night I finally stopped carrying it alone, hit subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because what Judge Briggs doesn't know is that the 9-year-old he patted on the shoulder grew up 2 blocks from his courthouse, and I never forgot what I saw. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I want to know who's here for this one. Let me take you back to the summer of 2001. Apalachicola is a small town, maybe 3,000 people on a generous count, most of them connected to the water. Oystering, shrimping, charter fishing. The kind of place where you knew every truck on the road, and if somebody's boat wasn't at the dock by dark, people noticed. Trent Overton ran charter trips out of Scipio Creek. He was 26, broad-shouldered, always sunburned, wore the same pair of Oakleys on his head every single day. He wasn't flashy, but he was the kind of guy who'd teach a 9-year-old how to tie a clinch knot and not get impatient when the kid couldn't get it right. That was me. He taught me. He'd carved these little wooden fishing lures by hand, painted them himself, and he gave me one the week before he died. A redfish pattern. I still have it. It sits on my nightstand. Sometimes I think it knows something. My dad had left when I was 6. Mom worked the front desk at the Gibson Inn. Trent wasn't a father figure. He was just a guy who was kind to a kid who didn't have a lot of kindness coming his way. And then, he was dead. The town grieved the way small towns grieve, covered dishes, whispered conversations at the Piggly Wiggly, and Judge Harlan Briggs, who'd known Trent since he was a teenager, who'd supposedly mentored him, helped him get his captain's license. He stood at the front of First Baptist and talked about loss and the river and God's mysterious ways. I sat in the 3rd pew, in a shirt that was too big for me, and I didn't understand how every adult in that room could just believe him. I need to tell you what I actually saw. It was June 14th, 2001, a Thursday. I know the date because it was the last day of school and I'd gotten a perfect score on my multiplication test, and I was so proud of it I'd carried the test paper around all day. I was supposed to be home by 9. I wasn't home by 9. I was down by the municipal dock because I wanted to watch the boats. That's all. I was 9. The dock was lit by 2 yellow bulbs on poles, and the rest was just moonlight and water. I was sitting behind a stack of crab traps near the end of the dock, eating a bag of Skittles I'd bought at the bait shop, when I heard voices. Trent and the judge. I recognized them both. Trent's voice was loud, not yelling, but close. He said something about leases, oyster leases. I didn't know what that meant. The judge's voice was low and steady, almost calm. I couldn't hear most of what he said, but I remember one thing. He said, "You're not thinking clearly, son." Then it got physical. Fast. The judge grabbed Trent by the front of his shirt. Trent tried to pull away. And then the judge, I don't know how else to say this, he pushed him, hard, over the edge of the dock. And Trent hit the water and I heard the splash and then, nothing. The judge stood there. I could see his profile against the dock light. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then he bent down, picked something up, I think it was Trent's hat, and walked back toward his car. He wasn't running. He wasn't panicked. He walked like a man leaving a restaurant. I stayed behind those crab traps for I don't know how long. An hour, maybe. I was shaking so bad I bit through my lip. When I told my mother, she told me I'd had a bad dream. When the deputy came to take my statement, and I'll give him credit, he did take a statement, I was 10 days past my 9th birthday. It was past midnight, and I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The deputy's report noted my statement. Then it noted that Judge Briggs was accounted for at his residence that evening, confirmed by his wife, Laureen. That was that. Trent's death was ruled accidental. Blood alcohol was .08, just over the limit. Easy story, easy close. And I grew up with that. I grew up watching Judge Briggs park his Lincoln Town car in the courthouse lot every weekday morning at 7:45. I grew up hearing people call him Judge, the way people in other towns might say Coach or Pastor, a title that meant something. That meant trust. I almost told someone again when I was 14. My 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Pace. I wrote an essay about a night I'll never forget, and I came close, real close, to putting the whole thing on paper, but I chickened out, changed it to a fishing trip with my uncle. By the time I was 17, I'd convinced myself that maybe my mother was right. Maybe I'd seen something different than what I thought. Maybe the dark and the distance and the fear had made it into something it wasn't. I'd almost believed that. Almost. Then I found the lure. I was cleaning out my closet before a move, and there it was in a shoebox. That little wooden redfish lure Trent had carved for me, and I held it, and I could feel the weight of the thing, and I knew I hadn't imagined anything. That man killed Trent Overton, and I watched him do it. But knowing and proving are two different countries, and I didn't have a passport to either one. I didn't do anything about it for years. I want to be honest about that. I went to trade school in Tallahassee, learned marine engine repair. One night, I must have been 19, the news in a bar near campus ran a story about a judge in Georgia getting indicted for corruption, and my whole body went rigid. My roommate asked what was wrong. I said it was nothing. It was always nothing. I came back to Apalachicola when I was 23 because the rent was cheap and I knew the water. Opened my shop, Whitfield Marine, on Water Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse where Judge Briggs still held session every other Tuesday. The first week I had the doors open, I was under a hull scraping barnacles and I heard that Lincoln Town car pull into the courthouse lot across the way. The engine had a tick in it. I could identify engines by sound. That was my job. And his was the one I knew best without wanting to. I saw him around. He'd nod at me. I'd nod back. My hands would be covered in grease and my jaw would be tight, and I'd nod at the man who killed Trent Overton, and then I'd go back to work. That was the arrangement. That was the deal I'd made with myself to survive living here. One afternoon, I was maybe 25, I almost broke it. I was at the Piggly Wiggly and I ran into Trent's mother, Greta. She was buying groceries and she looked old, older than she should have been. And she smiled at me and said, "Crosby, I haven't seen you in ages. You look so grown up." And I opened my mouth to say something. I swear I was about to tell her everything, right there between the cereal and the canned soup. And then I looked out the window, and Judge Briggs was walking past on the sidewalk, blazer on. That same walk. And I swallowed it. I said, "Good to see you, ma'am." And I left my cart in the aisle and walked out. I didn't bring up Trent. Not to anyone. Not once. The coroner's ruling said accident. Everyone trusted the process. Dr. Thibodeau had signed off on it himself, and people in town respected him, said he was thorough, meticulous. If the medical examiner said drowning, then drowning it was. Who was I to argue with that? Wait, I skipped something. The lure. After I found it in the closet, I put it on my nightstand, and it stayed there for years. Every night, last thing I saw before I turned the light off. Every morning, first thing when I woke up. I didn't touch it. I just knew it was there, and it knew I was there. Then in October of 2022, 21 years later, Trent's sister came into my shop, Nola Renfro. She'd been Nola Overton back when I knew her as a kid. She was 39 now, same as me. Worked as a records clerk for the Franklin County Courthouse. She came in because her husband's outboard was running rough, and while I was looking at it, she said something that stopped me cold. She said, You know, they're doing some dredging work upriver, by the old oyster beds near East Point, and they found some old pilings from a dock that was torn down in, I think 2003? And somebody at the county office made a joke about how that was where the Overton kid went in. She didn't laugh. Her jaw was tight. I said, I remember Trent. She looked at me, really looked, and she said, everybody remembers Trent. Nobody remembers the right way. I didn't know what to say to that. So I fixed her husband's outboard and charged her half price, and she left. And I stood in my shop for 20 minutes after she was gone, staring at the wall, with the fan clicking overhead and the smell of two-stroke oil in the air, thinking about that dock and that night and that bruised hand on my shoulder. 3 days later, I called her. I said I needed to tell her something. She came to my shop after work. It was already dark out, the marina lights were buzzing, and the tide was high enough I could hear the water lapping under the pilings. I told her everything: the dock, the voices, the push, the splash, the judge walking away, the deputy who took my statement, my mother who called it a dream. Nola didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just sat on the engine stand in my shop and stared at the floor for a long time. And then she said, I always knew it wasn't an accident. My mother knew too. She died knowing. That was the first time in 21 years that someone believed me. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you it felt good. It was something that should have happened a long time ago and hadn't. And now, it was just late. Now here's where I need to back up and tell you about the oyster leases. I didn't understand what Trent and the judge were arguing about when I was 9. I heard the word leases, and it meant nothing to me. But when Nola and I started looking into it, quietly, carefully, in her living room with her laptop and a box of county records she'd started pulling, it started to make sense. Apalachicola Bay oyster leases are valuable, or they were before the water crisis. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, those leases could generate serious money. The state manages them, but the county handles local administration, and Judge Briggs, through his position and his connections to the county commission, had influence over which families got leases and which didn't. Nola found something in the records. Between 1998 and 2001, 7 oyster leases in the most productive beds near Cat Point were transferred to a holding company called Gulf Bend Partners, LLC. And Gulf Bend Partners was registered to a P.O. box in Carabel, 30 minutes east, with no listed officer. It took Nola 2 weeks to trace the registration. The incorporation papers were filed by a paralegal in the judge's own law firm, the firm he'd had before he took the bench. Gulf Bend Partners was Harlan Briggs. Trent had figured this out. We think he'd figured it out because he worked those beds. He'd seen leaseholders get pushed out. Families who'd held leases for generations suddenly told their renewals weren't approved. And he'd gone to the judge about it, directly, because that's who Trent was. He didn't go to a lawyer or a reporter. He went to the man he thought was his mentor. And the man he thought was his mentor killed him on a dock in the middle of the night. Now, I want to pause here. If you've ever had somebody in your life who held power over your community, a judge, a sheriff, a school board chair, someone everyone trusted without question, and you found out they were lying? Not about something small, about something that mattered. I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me if you know that feeling. Because when Nola and I sat there looking at those incorporation papers, I felt sick. Not surprised. Sick. Like confirming the worst thing you ever suspected doesn't feel like victory. It feels like poison. But the oyster leases, that was motive. That wasn't proof of murder. And that's when I made a mistake. I started asking around about Duff Callahan. Duff Callahan had been the other name floating around after Trent died. He was an oysterman from East Point. Rough guy, loud, always in some kind of financial trouble. He and Trent had gotten into a public argument at the Indian Creek Raw Bar about a week before Trent died. Something about Duff owing Trent money for charter referrals. The argument got physical enough that the bartender had to separate them. When Trent turned up dead, a few people whispered about Duff. Nothing official. The investigation, if you can call it that, never seriously looked at anyone because the ruling was accidental drowning. But in the back channels of a small town, Duff's name came up. So I went to talk to Duff. He was 63 now, living in a trailer park outside Carabel, retired from the water because of his back. I found him sitting on his porch with a thermos of coffee and a dog that didn't like strangers. I told him I was looking into Trent's death. He got very quiet. Then he said, "I didn't kill that boy. I owed him $400 and I was embarrassed about it. That's all that was." He looked at me like he'd been waiting 20 years for someone to ask. I believed him. But I spent 3 weeks chasing that thread, talking to people who'd been at the bar that night, tracking down the bartender. Nothing. Every trail dead. It was Nola who pulled me back. She called me on a Tuesday night and said, "Crosby, you're looking at Duff because it's easier than looking at the judge." She was right, because looking at Duff Callahan meant looking at a guy who owed $400 and had a temper. Looking at Judge Briggs meant looking at the most powerful man in Franklin County and saying he committed murder and covered it up for 2 decades. New information killed the Duff theory completely. Nola found the original deputy's report, the full one, not the summary, buried in the archive boxes in the courthouse basement. And in the report, a convenience store clerk on Avenue E had told the deputy she'd seen Duff Callahan buying ice and bait at 11:15 the night of June 14th. At the store, 5 miles from the dock. Time-stamped on the register receipt. The deputy had noted it, and then never followed up on what it meant, which was that Duff was nowhere near that dock when Trent went in. So the false lead was dead, and the real trail was sitting in a courtroom every other Tuesday, wearing a tie and calling people counselor. I need to tell you about the first time Judge Briggs talked to me directly. After Nola and I started digging, I mean, not the funeral handshake, the real one. It was November of 2022. I was at the hardware store on Commerce Street, buying epoxy for a hull repair. Rain had been coming down all morning, and the gutters on Commerce were overflowing. The store smelled the way hardware stores do, sawdust and metal and something chemical underneath. And he walked in. 71 years old, still tall, still had that voice that filled a room without trying. Silver hair combed back, dressed for a ceremony on a Tuesday. He came up to me in the adhesives aisle and he said, "Crosby, I hear you've been asking some questions around town about old history." I said, "Just curious about some things." He smiled. That patient condescension, the way you'd explain something to a child who doesn't know better. And he said, "Curiosity is a fine quality, but you know, a man your age, with a business to run, a reputation in this community, sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Then he picked up a can of WD-40 and walked to the register. It was nothing to him. He'd told me to stop, and it cost him no more thought than picking up that can. That was the moment I understood what I was up against. Not the words, the delivery, the total calm. The way he said, "reputation in this community," reminding me that he could take it away. 2 weeks after that, the county building inspector showed up at my shop, unannounced. Said there'd been a complaint about my electrical wiring. I'd had that shop for 16 years, never once been inspected. The inspector, a guy named Platt, wouldn't look me in the eye, found 3 violations, minor stuff, but he shut me down for 9 days while I brought it up to code. 9 days of lost income. 3 customers who went to the shop in Carabel instead. I knew who was behind it. Nola knew too. She said, "He's not going to stop. This is just the beginning." Then she asked if I'd eaten anything that day. I hadn't. She went out and came back with 2 sandwiches from the cafe on Market Street, and we ate them sitting on the shop floor while the lights were off because I didn't have a permit to run them. Now I want to stop for a second and put a question to you. If you were me, if you knew what you'd seen as a kid, and you finally had someone who believed you, but the person you were going up against could shut your business down with a phone call, would you keep going? Or would you let it go? I'm curious where you'd draw the line, because I've met people on both sides of that decision, and I don't think either one is wrong. Drop it in the comments. I want to hear what you think. But then something happened that made quitting impossible. And it had nothing to do with oyster leases or building inspectors. It had to do with a box that Nola found in the courthouse basement. A box that was supposed to have been destroyed 17 years ago. The box was labeled Overton, T, MISC, Evidence, Destroy per Order 04-117. It was supposed to have been incinerated in 2004 as part of a routine evidence purge. But the clerk who was supposed to destroy it, a woman named Bertie Hinson, who'd worked the records room for 30 years, had put it on a shelf in the back corner of the basement instead. Nola found it in January of 2023 while doing a routine inventory. She called me from the courthouse basement. Her voice was steady, but I could hear her breathing fast. She said, "Crosby, you need to come look at something." I got there in 10 minutes. The box was sitting on a folding table under a fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered. Nola was wearing the cotton gloves she used for old records. She opened the lid, and the first thing I saw was a photograph. I didn't understand what I was looking at right away. It was a wide shot of the dock, the municipal dock, taken from an angle that showed the planks near the edge. Morning light. There were scuff marks on the wood and I had to look twice, what looked like a bloodstain. I turned it over. Written on the back, scene documentation, June 15th, 2001, 7:14 a.m. Then Nola pulled out the deputy's original handwritten notes from the night of June 14th, 2001. She unfolded them carefully. Below those was a Ziploc bag. Inside was a button, a brass button, the kind you'd find on a blazer. And at the bottom, the coroner's report. Nola recognized the handwriting on the margins before she read the words. "That's Thibodeau's hand," she said. The official report said drowning consistent with accidental fall, but the margin notes, handwritten in Dr. Emile Thibodeau's hand, said something different. Contusion, posterior skull, inconsistent with flat fall. Query blunt force. Discussed with HB, agreed not to pursue. HB, Harlan Briggs. I had to put the paper down. My hands were shaking, not from anger, from 22 years of knowing I wasn't crazy. And here was the proof that I wasn't, and it still didn't feel like enough. Nola said, "He told the coroner to ignore the head wound." I said, "Yeah." She said, "The coroner listened." "Yeah." Dr. Thibodeau was dead, heart attack in 2016, so we couldn't talk to him. But his notes were in his own handwriting, on an official document, in a box that should have been destroyed and wasn't. Bertie Hinson had saved that box. I don't know if she knew what was in it. I don't know if she suspected something, or if she was just the kind of woman who couldn't bring herself to burn records. Either way, she saved it, and she'd been dead since 2019. That button. The brass button. It didn't match anything Trent owned. His family confirmed that. Nola asked her aunt, Trent's mother, without explaining why. "Trent didn't own anything with brass buttons," her aunt said. "He lived in t-shirts and board shorts." But Judge Briggs. I remembered this, suddenly, clearly. Judge Briggs had been wearing a blazer that night, on the dock, in the summer heat, a navy blazer with brass buttons. I could see it in my memory. I'd seen it 100 times since. Every time he wore that blazer to a county function, I saw it. I took the wooden lure off my nightstand, Trent's lure, the one he'd carved for me, and I put it in my pocket. I started carrying it every day. I was carrying a promise I hadn't made yet, but was about to. Like, subscribe, and stay with me. You need to hear what happened next. Now things started to get strange. Not dangerous yet, just off. In February 2023, someone left an unsigned note under my shop door. Typed, not handwritten. It said, "Some fish aren't meant to be caught. Leave the net alone." I found it at 6:45 in the morning. I was unlocking the shop, coffee in one hand, and I saw the white envelope on the concrete. The sun wasn't all the way up yet, that gray-blue light you get on the water in February, and I stood there reading it twice before my hands started to shake. I showed it to Nola. She photographed it. We didn't go to the police because, well, the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and Judge Briggs had been in the same orbit for decades. Chief Deputy Warren Eubanks played golf with the judge every Saturday. That wasn't paranoia. That was a tea time you could verify. A week after the note, I was locking up around 7 in the evening. Sky going orange, mullet jumping in the basin, and I noticed a white Ford F250 parked across the street. No plates I could read from my door. It was there the next night too, and the night after that. Same spot, engine off, windows up. On the fourth night, it wasn't there. I never saw it again. But I checked every evening for a month. That habit, checking the street before anything else every time I locked up, stayed with me longer than the truck did.
I'm telling you these things because they mattered. They were small, and they were creepy, and they sat in the back of my head while I tried to work. I'd be elbow deep in a Johnson outboard, and I'd hear a car door, and my whole body would tense. Nola was taking risks too. She was pulling records from the courthouse during her lunch breaks. Property transfers, oyster lease files, commission meeting minutes from 1998 to 2002. She was careful. She never took originals, only made copies on the old Xerox in the annex. But she knew that if anyone connected what she was doing to what I was doing, she'd lose her job. 14 years at that courthouse. Gone.
We started building a timeline. Not a case. We weren't law enforcement. A timeline. Trent's movements the last week of his life. The lease transfers to Gulf Bend Partners. The judge's schedule. The coroner's report and the margin notes. The deputy's original notes. My own statement from when I was 9. I kept thinking about what the judge had said in the hardware store. A man your age with a business to run. And I kept thinking, he's right. I do have a business. I do have a life here. Is it worth it? And then I'd look at the lure. Trent's lure. And I'd think about a 26-year-old man who went to the person he trusted most and got killed for it. That one thought. That was what kept me going. Not bravery, just the weight of what I knew. By March 2023, we had a folder. Not a legal brief, just a collection of everything we'd gathered. The coroner's margin notes, the evidence box photos, the oyster lease paper trail, my original statement, the timeline showing the judge had motive and opportunity, the brass button that matched his blazer. We needed help. Real help. Legal help. Nola had a cousin who worked in the state attorney general's office in Tallahassee. Not a prosecutor, she was an administrative coordinator, but she knew people. Nola called her and explained, carefully, vaguely at first, that she had questions about a cold case in Franklin County and didn't trust the local channels. 2 weeks later, a man named Carver showed up at my shop. Plain clothes, State Attorney General's cold case unit. He didn't give me his full name that day, just Carver. He was maybe 50, quiet, took notes in a leather-bound notebook, and he listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I was done, he said, "I'd like to see the evidence box." Nola brought it to my shop the next Saturday. Carver looked at the coroner's notes for a long time. Then he said, "These margin notes, discussed with HB, agreed not to pursue. This is the medical examiner documenting that a judicial officer instructed him to suppress a finding. That's not nothing." I said, "I know." He said, "The problem is that this is 22 years old. The coroner is deceased. The physical evidence from the scene is likely degraded or gone. A case this old, with these players, it's going to be hard. I know that too." He closed his notebook and said, "But hard isn't impossible." April through August of 2023. That's when things really started to move, and also when they got the worst. Carver brought in a forensic pathologist from Tallahassee, I never got her name, who reviewed the coroner's report and the margin notes. Her written opinion, based on Thibodeau's own description of the contusion, was that the injury was highly inconsistent with an unbraced fall from a low dock, and consistent with a strike from a blunt object or a forceful push against a fixed structure. That opinion went into the State Attorney General's file, along with everything else. Carver told me the AG's office was reviewing the full package. He said it could take weeks, maybe longer. And then he said something that put a clock on it. The Franklin County Historical Society was giving Judge Briggs a Lifetime Service Award at the Seafood Festival in September. If the state moved before that, the timing would matter. If they moved after, the judge would have one more trophy on his shelf and one more round of applause to hide behind. Meanwhile, Judge Briggs was getting nervous. I don't know how he found out, but he did. Small town. Someone saw Carver's state-plated car at my shop, or someone at the courthouse noticed Nola's copy patterns, or I don't know. Somebody talked. In May, the judge showed up at the Owl Cafe, where I was eating lunch alone. My back was to the door, and I didn't hear him come in. He sat down across from me, uninvited. I had a half-eaten grouper sandwich in front of me, and he folded his hands on the table and he said, and I will never forget this, he said, "Crosby, I've always thought of you as a good kid. Even when you were small, telling those wild stories about that night. I felt sorry for you. I still do." He leaned forward. "But I need you to understand something. This town respects me because I've earned that respect. And a man who makes accusations he can't prove, well, that man tends to find out what it's like to be the one nobody believes." He stood up, put a $5 bill on the table for my coffee, and walked out. I sat there for 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I couldn't. The waitress came by twice, and I just shook my head. The thing about a man like Judge Briggs is that he doesn't need to threaten you with specifics. He threatens you with himself, with everything he is in the town, with 30 years of authority so deep it's in the groundwater. You don't fight that. You just stand on it and hope it holds. But it wasn't holding. Not anymore. In June, Nola got called into the courthouse administrator's office and told that her position was being restructured. No cause given. No warning. 14 years of service. She was offered a transfer to a records position in Calhoun County, an hour's drive each way. She took it. She didn't fight. She just packed her desk, drove home, and called me from her car and said, "He's trying to scatter us." I said, "Is it working?" She said, "Ask me tomorrow." She showed up at my shop the next morning with a flash drive. She'd copied everything, every file, every record, every document she'd pulled over the last 6 months, before she left. I didn't ask if that was legal. I figured we were past that. That night, I was alone in the shop. I opened a browser and searched for boat repair shops in Pensacola. Found 3 with good reviews. One was hiring. I stared at that listing for a long time. Thought about what a fresh start would feel like. No judge, no doc, no bruised hand on my shoulder every time I closed my eyes. I closed the browser. I picked up the lure. And I sat there in the dark until the marina lights kicked off at midnight. And I want to ask you something, right now. What I was about to do, taking everything I had to the state and hoping they'd actually move on a sitting circuit judge before they handed him a Lifetime Achievement Award, would you have gone through with it? Knowing it might destroy your business, your reputation, your life in this town? That clock was ticking. The seafood festival was 3 months away, and once they gave him that award, he'd be untouchable for another decade. Drop your answer in the comments. Because I stood in my shop that night, and I turned that lure over in my hands for I don't know how long, and I want to know, would you have kept going? What I decided was this: I'd rather lose everything than keep pretending. The summer of 2023 was the loneliest I'd ever been. Nola was driving to Calhoun County every day. Hour there, hour back. She'd call me from the road sometimes, not to talk about the case, just to talk. She'd complain about the bridge traffic on 98 or tell me her daughter had learned to do a cartwheel. Normal things. I think she knew I needed normal things. Carver had gone quiet. He told me the state AG's office was reviewing the file, but these things take time. My shop was slow. I'd lost 4 regular customers since the building inspection. People in town had started looking at me differently. Not hostile, just careful. The way you'd be around someone you didn't trust but couldn't avoid. One night in June, I was at the gas station on Avenue E, filling up my truck, and a woman I'd known since high school, I won't say her name, was on the other side of the pump. She looked at me, and I could see her deciding whether to say hello. She chose not to, just got in her car and drove off. That's a specific kind of loneliness. When your own town starts editing you out of conversations. I thought about quitting. I didn't just think about it. I packed a box. One night in late June, I took a cardboard box from the shop and put in my socket set, my best torque wrench, the calibration tools I'd bought with my own money. I taped it shut. I wrote Pensacola on it with a Sharpie, and it sat by my front door for 11 days before I unpacked it. What Nola was going through was worse, and I knew it. She'd lost her position, 14 years, because of me. Because of my story. I'd lie awake thinking, what if I'm wrong? I wasn't wrong. I knew I wasn't wrong. But at 3 in the morning, alone, doubt doesn't care what you know. And the question that kept me up wasn't whether the judge did it. It was whether I had the right to drag Nola down with me. I never asked her that. I was afraid of the answer. But you know what kept me? It's almost embarrassing. There's a bench on the seawall near the bridge, and I used to sit there evenings and watch the boats come in. And one evening in July, a kid, maybe 9, 10 years old, was fishing off the wall with his grandfather. The kid caught a pinfish and held it up, and his whole face lit up. And I thought about Trent, how he used to light up the same way when a kid caught a fish on one of his charters. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for a man who can't speak for himself, a man who carved lures and taught kids to fish and walked onto a dock trusting the wrong person. That was the thought that unpacked the box. In early August, Carver called. The AG's office was moving. They were going to approach Judge Briggs for a voluntary interview. The timeline was accelerating. Carver didn't say why, but I knew. The Seafood Festival was 5 weeks out. The Lifetime Achievement Award was 5 weeks out. I need to tell you about August 19th, 2023, because that's the day everything broke open, and it didn't happen the way I planned. It didn't happen the way anyone planned. The Franklin County Historical Society held a fundraiser dinner at the Coombs house on August 19th. Small event, maybe 50 people. White tablecloths, candles, the good china. The Seafood Festival was 2 weeks away. Judge Briggs was there. Of course he was. Sitting at the head table, laughing at something the mayor's wife had said, holding a glass of sweet tea like a scepter. Trent's aunt, Merle Overton, was there. 81 years old, still sharp, still carrying 22 years of buried grief in her spine and her jaw and the way she held her purse with both hands. I was there because Nola had asked me to come. I didn't want to be there, but I went. I sat at a table near the back with Nola and 2 people I didn't know. The crab cakes were good. The corn was local. The judge was 20 feet away, telling a story about the time he'd caught a tarpon off St. George Island, and people were laughing. I looked around the room. The mayor's wife adjusting her napkin. The county commissioner pouring sweet tea. A woman from the Historical Society arranging flowers on the podium. Normal. Completely normal. The kind of evening that happens in small towns and means nothing and is forgotten by Monday. And then Merle Overton stood up. Nobody asked her to. Nobody knew she was going to. She just stood up in the middle of dinner, and the room got quiet the way rooms get quiet when something unexpected happens, and everyone can feel it. She looked at the judge, directly at him, and she said, "Harlan, I've got something to say, and I'm going to say it in front of God and everybody." The judge smiled, that patient smile. "Merle, of course. What's on your mind?" And then, before Merle could speak, he added almost gently, "You know, Merle, you and I are both getting on in years. Sometimes old memories play tricks. Why don't you sit down and we'll talk after—" "Don't," Merle's voice cut the room. "Don't you tell me to sit down." She was shaking, not from frailty, from something that had been locked in a box for 22 years and had just found the key. "My sister Greta died in 2019, she said. "She died not knowing what happened to her boy. She died not knowing." Her voice cracked on the last word and she stopped, pressed her hand to her mouth. The room was so quiet I could hear the candles. Then she straightened up. "Trent called me the afternoon he died, June 14th, 2001. 4:17 in the afternoon. He said, 'Aunt Merle, the judge is going to be upset, but he needs to hear this.' He was talking about those oyster leases. That was the last thing my nephew ever said to me." She looked around the room, then back at the judge. "I kept that phone bill. I kept it in a box under my bed for 22 years because I knew that night wasn't an accident." The judge stood up. His chair scraped back loud. "Merle, this is a social event. This isn't the place—" "22 years, Harlan." Tears were running down her face, but her voice held. "And the coroner wrote in his own notes that the head wound didn't match a fall. Nola showed me. And a 9-year-old boy saw you on that dock." She pointed at me. Her fingers shook, but did not waver. "And you patted him on the head at the funeral. You patted him on the head." The judge's face was white, and he said, and this is the part that matters, he said, "Trent was drunk that night. Everyone knows that. This is ancient history and I won't—" He stopped, because the room had shifted. because nobody outside of law enforcement was supposed to know Trent's blood alcohol level that night. The BAC was in the sealed coroner's report, not public, never reported in the newspaper, never mentioned at the funeral. The only way to know Trent had been drinking was to have been there or to have read the sealed file. And he'd just said it in front of 50 people. The silence after that was the loudest thing I've ever heard. He tried to recover. I'm not going to dignify this with a response. You've all known me for 30 years. He looked around the room. Nobody looked back. Not one person at those tables met his eyes. Not the mayor's wife. Not the county commissioner. Not the church deacon who'd sat in his pew for decades. I stood up. I didn't plan to. I just stood. And I said, "She's telling the truth. And so am I." That was all I said. 7 words. The judge looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear on his face. Real, unguarded fear. Not of me, of the room, of the silence, of the fact that the story he'd built for 22 years was falling apart in front of crab cakes and sweet corn. He left, walked straight out the front door, didn't say goodbye to anyone. His wife followed him. Nobody stopped them. Merle sat down. Nola held her hand. And I stood there in that dining room with my heart going so fast I could feel it in my teeth, and I thought, it's over. It's finally over. It wasn't over. Not legally, but the dinner changed everything. I drove home that night, got about halfway, past the bridge, past East Point, on that dark stretch of 98 where there's nothing but pines and water on both sides, and I had to pull over. I put the truck in park on the shoulder, and I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I could not move. I just sat there, the engine running, the headlights cutting into nothing, and 22 years of carrying that weight came out of me all at once. I don't know how long I sat there. I know my hands wouldn't let go of the wheel. I know I couldn't see the road through what was coming out of my eyes. And I know that for the first time since I was 9 years old, I wasn't carrying it alone. 3 people at that fundraiser called the state attorney general's office the following week to offer witness statements. One hesitated, called Nola first, said she was afraid of retaliation, asked what would happen if the judge came after her the way he'd come after my shop. Nola told her the truth. She didn't know. The woman called the AG's office anyway. She was the county commissioner's assistant, and she said she'd overheard the judge making a phone call in 2004 about making sure the Overton evidence was disposed of. A 4th person, a man I'd fixed boats for years, came into my shop and said he wanted to help but couldn't. He said, "My wife works for the county, Crosby. I can't." I told him I understood. I did. Carver called me on August 24th. He said the investigation had been accelerated. On September 11th, 2023, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement opened a formal homicide investigation into the death of Trent Overton. The coroner's margin notes, the forensic pathologist's opinion, the oyster lease paper trail, Merle's phone records, and my sworn statement were all entered into the case file. The Lifetime Achievement Award was quietly removed from the Seafood Festival program. Nobody made an announcement. It just wasn't there anymore. On October 3rd, Judge Harlan Briggs was suspended from the bench pending investigation. His 30-year career, gone in one filing. The Judicial Qualifications Commission moved to strip his eligibility before the criminal case even went to trial. On November 15th, Harlan Briggs was arrested at his home on Commerce Street and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Trent Overton. The arrest was made by FDLE agents, not local deputies. The warrant cited evidence of violent altercation, suppression of forensic findings, and destruction of evidence. His wife, Laureen, stood on the front porch and watched them put him in the car. I heard about that from 3 different people. Nobody told it different. She didn't say a word. The trial was set for March 2024. He pled not guilty. After the arrest, something happened that I didn't expect. People started coming to my shop. Not customers, just people. Folks who'd known Trent. Folks who'd known me as a kid. A woman named Della, who worked at the post office, came in and said, "I should have listened to you when you were little. I'm sorry." She had tears in her eyes when she said it. Not everyone felt that way. A man at the marina, older guy, fished with the judge for years, stopped me on the dock and said, "You know you've torn this town apart, right?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Maybe he was right. Maybe some truths do that. The owner of the Indian Creek Raw Bar brought me a plate of fried oysters. Didn't say anything, just left them on my counter and walked out. And Merle called me, on the phone, and she said, "Crosby, Trent would have been so proud of you." And I lost it. I couldn't hold it together anymore. I sat in my shop and I cried. For the first time in 22 years. Well, second time, after the truck. Nola got her old position back at the Franklin County Courthouse. Nobody had to fight for it. The administrator just called her and said there'd been a reassessment and her position was available. Nola said, "I bet there was." The trial happened in Tallahassee. Change of venue. The judge's lawyers requested it and the prosecution agreed. Small courtroom, fluorescent lights, nothing dramatic about the setting. The state presented the coroner's notes, the forensic pathologist's testimony, the oyster lease evidence showing motive, Merle's phone records, and my testimony. I sat in that witness chair and I told them what I saw when I was 9. Every detail. The voices, the push, the splash, the judge walking away, the bruised hand at the funeral. The defense attorney spent 40 minutes trying to shake me, asked me about the lighting, the distance, whether I'd been scared, whether a scared 9-year-old could really distinguish faces in dark light at that distance. I answered every question the same way, with what I remembered, because I remembered all of it. The defense argued that a 9-year-old's memory from 22 years ago wasn't reliable. They argued the coroner's margin notes were informal and not part of the official record. They argued the oyster leases were a civil matter, not evidence of homicide. And they never addressed, not once in the entire trial, how their client knew Trent's blood alcohol level that night. The prosecution brought it up. The defense had no answer. The jury didn't buy it. On March 22, 2024, Harlan Briggs was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years. He was 72. He'll die in prison. I watched them lead him out of the courtroom. He didn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead. And I thought, for half a second, about the man who'd stood at the front of First Baptist and given Trent's eulogy, the man who'd organized the memorial, the man who'd shaken hands and eaten casseroles and been a pillar, and I let it go. That night I drove back to Apalachicola, 5 hours on I-10 in the dark, got home around midnight. I walked into my shop, turned on the light, and sat at my workbench, and I took the wooden lure out of my pocket. Trent's lure, the one I'd been carrying for months, and I set it on the shelf above the bench, not hidden in a box, not in a drawer, on the shelf, where I could see it. And this is the part where I want to talk to you, directly. If you've been here this whole time, and I know you have because you're still listening, thank you. I mean that. This story lived inside me for 22 years. I never told it to anyone who believed me until Nola sat on that engine stand in my shop. And now, I've told it to you. All of it. And it means more than I can say that you stayed for the whole thing. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about the things we carry and the people who deserve to be remembered, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories coming. Stories about people who wouldn't stop until the truth came out. So if you want to hear them, you know where to find me. And if you've got a story, something you've been carrying, something nobody believed, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. One more thing. Trent Overton was a good man. He was kind to a kid who needed it. He carved wooden lures and taught people to fish, and he trusted the wrong person, and it cost him his life. I don't want you to remember Judge Briggs. I want you to remember Trent. I sleep through the night now. First time in years. I open the shop at 7, same as always. The water's still there. The boats still come in. And on my shelf above the bench, there's a little wooden redfish lure, painted by hand, and it catches the light every morning. That's enough for me.